something that we face day in and day out. So don't be going around talking about, woe is me, why am I like this? Is it because I made a bad choice and married the wrong person? Listen, rich people don't marry poor people. I mean, that's the Cinderella thing, you know. So, you know, poverty is getting worse and worse every day.
Okay.
I forgot about that. Every day. So, you know, welfare rights overall goal has been, from its inception, is that our goal is to eliminate poverty. Now, I'm waiting for the day that we don't even have to have welfare rights. I will not be able to see it, but that will be a hell of a leap forward, because you are not going to eliminate poverty until you eliminate this system. And you heard that from me. And I want to be one of the people involved in helping that to go down.
That's really the focus of some of our questions, is about your evolution of your theoretical perspective and how you put it into practice. We heard about your civil rights experience and then move on to anti-poverty experience. We didn't hear a lot about the League and the evolution of theory within the League,
He can talk about
in terms of what that experience was like and what prompted you to change your theoretical perspective and put it into practice. Because in school, as you said, we learn about theory, and that's usually about it. So what was the theoretical perspective in the League when you first started organizing?
First of all, let's remember one thing, that you don't arrive at that stuff overnight. And it was through our practical experience, through all those various movements, that a lot of us came to the conclusion that, look, this is not working. Although we had been involved in all the various organizations and stuff, like, it's got to be something else. So, finally came to the conclusion we had to sit down and start studying. And so, you can take it from now. I need some water.
Yes. I don't know whose was it?
That's
Okay. you can take that.
that's for you both.
You're gonna need this.
No.
I need to get up because I know I'm stiff.
George, you need the water too.
It's you, Baker.
Give
Give him a question.
How you start?
Give us your name and
Cereal.
what's your organization and age,
Yeah.
where you live.
My name's General Baker Jr. and I'm homegrown. I was born here in Detroit, over in Black Bottom in 1941. Matter of fact, the great Dr. Osea Sweet was the one that delivered me, you know, when I was born. Osea Sweet is a doctor, you know, that's famous for, and has that house on Garland and Kirchville Street with the monument in front of him, because he shot up a bunch of white demonstrators that was protesting about it moving in that house. And as a matter of fact, Clarence Darrow had to be flew in here. The NAACP hired Clarence Darrow, a famous attorney, to defend it. So he's somewhat famous. But I was born here. My parents are sharecroppers from Georgia that had came here, you know, I think we refer to it as following the promised land. You know, my dad then came here looking for work in the factories. And so my father was a factory worker. My mother was a homemaker. I have three sisters, one older, two younger. We lived over on Charlevoix and Shane, just south of Gratiot, in that area that's called Black Bottom, essentially where most of the black population moved to when they first came here. My family moved after the war in '45 to southwest Detroit, way out by Ecorse and River Rouge, and that's where I grew up at pretty much. And my school life took place at the Boyden Elementary School, Southwestern High School.
Could you discuss a little bit more about Black Bottom?
Well, Black Bottom is the area or territory of the city where it was a real concentration of blacks. Most of you got to understand that in the 40s, when you had this out-migration from the South, that you had many people flooding to Detroit to go to work in these factories. Most of the blacks had to settle south of Gratiot. And that whole area south of Gratiot, all the way to the river, or all the way to Atwater Street, was called Black Bottom. So that's where the concentration of blacks was. Polish population that came in lived a different place, up on the other side of Gratiot, you know, and up into to Hamtramck. Southern whites were moving pretty much to the lower west side. So you had these concentration of the kind of ethnic breakdown in Detroit neighborhoods in that period of time. So Black Bottom is referred to as that territory south of Gratiot going to the riverfront that runs from almost downtown all the way out to, I think at that early day, at least almost to Mack. Later it spread further than that, but that's the territory known as Black Bottom. I spent most of my life, you know, I grew up in the city, went to the schools. I went to integrated high schools. I went to Southwestern High School when there was no school in Taylor, Michigan, and no schools out in Ecorse, and therefore white kids were bused into Southwestern High School every day. That's when busing was going backward. You know, later we get a period when blacks was on buses, and you had all this protests, but it was all right as long as white kids was riding buses to black schools, essentially. So that's the era I went to. I ended up going to Highland Park Community College after I finished graduation. Let me say this: I think life was quite difficult in that period. I finished high school in 1958, and 1958 was sort of like a watershed year in the economy in the city. Most of the plants, the auto plants in this town, most of them laid off people in about 1958. People hit the street, didn't go back until almost 1963. The leading event in that period of time was the end of the Korean conflict. I think it was in 1954, the Pyongyang, Treaty of Pyongyang, Panmunjom, that settled the disputes in Vietnam and Korea and brought troops back home. By the time troops got back home, you know, after the war years, and the whole bottom fell out of the economy. 1958 is kind of the banner year, because I think when you're talking about the auto industry, that's the year this the Edsel Ford was created. Edsel had to be the biggest flop in automobile history. It came out that year, it didn't last a year, and you ain't never heard nothing about Edsel ever since. So those are real difficult times for us. Massive layoffs and unemployment. I know in 1958 was the first time in my life I've ever seen commodity cheese. Things with Eisenhower was the president of the country then, and the unions were organizing trainloads of people to go to Washington, D.C. to protest the Eisenhower administration. It was difficult times to be living in the streets, because whenever unemployment is high, so is crime. A guy by the name of Louis Mariani was the mayor of the city of Detroit, who had a real militantly right-wing outlook. He had a police department that just constantly harassed blacks all the time. I got arrested and picked up, and they could hold you 72 hours, you know, just on suspicion back in those days. And I got picked up a couple times on my way to school at Highland Park Community College, but life was really difficult. Things did not get better pretty much until 1960 with the election of President Kennedy. And when Kennedy got elected, it wasn't not necessarily his election, but you had the beginning and outbreak of the Vietnam War in early 1961, 60, and 62. And with that was an expansion of the economy. So people started getting called back to work. I think the first big influx back into the factories became 1963. That's when Chuck and I both got hired at the Ford Rouge plant in 1963. Let me tell you a little bit about that period of time so you got a sense of that history. I remember we both got hired at the Dearborn assembly plant, Dearborn stamping plant, and we were making parts for the Mustang. The Mustang car didn't come out until April of 1964. But we had to make the stampings and things, you know, for the car prior to its assembly in 1964. And just to give you an idea of the economy and what money was like then. I remember that the new Mustang sold for $1,500, brand new. And I could still see the big sign with a Mustang on it for $1,500. Now one will cost you $35,000, $1,500. That's when Wilson Pickett came out with his famous song, Mustang Sally, because they were actually saying the Mustang was the second car, therefore the woman's car. And that's the spirit in which Wilson Pickett made that song. I think that's kind of important because the Mustang been here ever since, right? It's been booming. Right now, I think the last report they had even earlier this year, they can't make enough of them. You know, that you got a backlog on buying Mustangs. I don't know why, who would want them, but you know, that's the status of affairs. So I just want to say, I think one characteristic thing about that period of time was that if you were a young male in this town, you were going to one of these auto factories in Detroit because that's what was Detroit. And as far back as 1966, Chrysler Corporation was the largest employer in the city of Detroit. They employed 66,000 people in '66. Now they don't have 66,000 people all across the nation. But I just want to show you how phenomenal the auto industry was. Chrysler Corporation had 29 plants in the Detroit area. You know, so work was so plentiful in that period of the '60s. You could work day shift at this plant, get fired, and start afternoon shift at the plant down the street. And that's just the way life was. Auto paid good. I remember when my first job I ever got was at the F.W. Woolworth's 10-cent store on the boulevard of Woodward. And I was the janitor sweeping the sidewalk. Chuck had to remember that.
I do.
And I made $1.10 an hour. I brought home $42.50 a week for working 48 hours. So I brought home less dollars than hours that I made every week. But rent was cheap. When I first got my first apartment over on Richard and Lawton, I think the rent at that apartment, two-bedroom apartment, was $66 a month. And I had 2 roommates, so my cut was $20. You know, so I had $20 rent. I mean, they just try to show you what life was like. But when we went to work at Ford Motor Company, we were paid about $2.72 an hour, I think, which doubled my income. And most of us, that's when we started developing the habit where we wouldn't work but 4 days a week because we had enough money already to make it. You know, so I mean, they started talking those stories about the auto industry. Nobody's at work on Fridays and Mondays because you're spending your money. But at the same time, life had its other side. I think that's important, and that is, back in those days when no such thing as credit. You had no credit, and it was cash or you didn't get it. And you know, nothing like the situation today where I think it was only a couple places in town that would finance anything for blacks, and I think that was what was a couple of names of those? Good Housekeeping, and
Yeah.
I think Shepherd Willis that was selling jewelry. You know, black folks like jewelry, so they was giving you a little bit of credit, 90 days, same as cash, I think they used to call it.
At Sam's.
Yeah, Sam's, places like that. And I want to tell you this point, because if you understand how life was back then, the pawn shop was a real institution in the black communities, you know, because you go out when you get paid on Thursday and go out Friday, buy your new set of clothes and things, spend all your money and party all weekend. About the middle of the next week, you ain't got enough money left to get back to work, so you had to pawn that new stuff you'd bought just to get to work. And I want to say that because the pawn shop was a real important institution in the black community. Everybody had something in that pawn shop, especially if you're living down off of 12th Street. You had to pawn something in the middle of the week and then get it back on the weekend. You know, even your record player. I remember when they first came out with them boom boxes. You know, the pawn shop used to be full of those because you couldn't have enough money to survive the rest of the week. And I think that's important because when you get to the 67 rebellion and you understand the role that the pawn shop and the other institution I think that they don't talk about is the Blind Pig. And the Blind Pig was simply the name that they had for after-hour joints back then. You know, we working in these shops, most of the young workers had to work afternoons because afternoon shift was low seniority, right? When you got more seniority, then you exercise your shift preference and went to days. Well, when you worked afternoon shift, their plants was working so long, we was working sometimes 12-hour shifts, getting off at 3 o'clock in the morning. All the bars in this town closed at 2. So you had these after-hour joints almost on every block somewhere. Somebody was making, they made their own moonshine and corn whiskey. And then they'd fry up some chicken, you know, and have a little music on. And when you get off, we used to go to these blind pigs. You know, especially on Friday payday, you know, the blind pig would be full. All over the North End, they had different little blind pigs. And I think it's important that you understand that these things was institutions. And even though they're considered quasi-legal or illegal, everybody knew they existed and everybody used them, you know. I remember reading in the paper one time, 2 guys were arrested for stealing a hot water heater in a bathtub, and they was pulling it down the street in a wagon from an abandoned house. Now that may not make sense generally if you don't generally, but those are the instruments of production for producing moonshine and homebrew. You had to have the old hot water heater to cook the homebrew in to make the beer, and he run it off in the bathtub. And so you can see that people don't think of that, but those are the instruments of production used in the process of producing illegal whiskey or illegal beer. I tell you how bad it was. Sometimes when we used to go to those early AA meetings, you'd hear some of the old black people in there talking about the first time they drank whiskey with a label on it or with a seal on it, because they had become alcoholics when they weren't drinking nothing but moonshine. And they didn't know nothing about this whiskey with a seal on it. Yeah, store-bought stuff came on later on. So I'm just trying to give you kind of a history of the kind of life and culture and stuff that we live with. But I think it's important though, because you got to remember that they claim the 1967 rebellion started because the police arrested all these people at a blind pig. And I wanted to tell you that earlier so you know what a blind pig was. This particular one was a big one on 12th Street. They had about 100 and some people in there that evening. They were playing cards, some would gamble and throw dice, but the main thing was the center that operated after the bars closed. You know, Detroit ain't Chicago, Detroit ain't New York, Detroit ain't New Orleans. You know, those cities, bars pretty much stay open all night. Well, Detroit was a working town, the bars closed at 2, always been that way. You had to have something for entertainment. Life in these shops was so difficult that, you know, we used to talk about it all the time out to the Dodge main plant when we worked there. You'd have people that worked one shift and drank the next. So you had a whole core of people in the alley that used to work for 8 hours and drink for the next 8 hours, then go home and sleep and come back in the morning. and it was quite a crowd that used to do that. And I think it's important because when we started organizing in the factory, that group in the alley that was drinking became our organizing base, you see, because they were going to spend another whole shift just drinking, you know. And when we at the Hamtramck assembly plant that Chuck and I both later worked at, we hired in at Ford. But what happened when we were hired in at Ford, we also belonged to a little organization on Wayne State's campus named Uhuru. And in that little organization we used to put out all kind of little agitational leaflets on Wayne. Every time something would come up, we'd go over to the Monteith Center that was supposed to be, one at the Intellectual Center or the Philosophical Center, and they had a ditto machine. That was before they had mimeograph machine. And you had to draw you a little cartoon of somebody busting somebody in the head and run off a few of them, and we'd pass these leaflets out. We used to go down there all the time in the morning. I had a friend of mine, Lorenzo, that I was living with, and we'd go down to the student center and harass all the Greeks. Remember? Because you had all these people pledging, and we catching all kind of hell, all kind with civil rights struggle need people. You run around talking about you Greek. Remember? Anyway, I mean, that was kind of, I'm giving you kind of a cultural light side of the struggle. We in Uhuru, I guess the biggest event we had was when we got arrested. I guess Chuck, when in 1964 was the first arrest. I'm not sure if that's bigger than 63, but I'm not sure if that's bigger than the march in Detroit in 1963. It was probably the biggest event that we were in. So that's the biggest civil rights event that I'd ever seen. The march in Detroit was almost as big, if not bigger, than the march in Washington that year. And King came in and led that march. It was a massive march. Matter of fact, you didn't have to march. If you lined up at Warren Avenue, you got pushed all the way to the river. It was that kind of crowd. I know Chuck and I both was in that march, and they've been trying to repeat that over and over again, but they never been able to, because things were so intense in this city at that time. Earlier that year, the police department had killed this prostitute named Cynthia Scott. Matter of fact, the officer's name was Officer Spicer, and it was clear that they had an affair. He got angry, shot her 3 times in the back, just assassinated her, and never went to trial. So, you know, the whole city was in an uproar about that. Our little group, Uhuru, went and rented us a little megaphone and had street rallies down on 12th Street, one of the Brewster projects and one of Jeffrey's projects, mobilizing people around that issue. So all those issues had played into this thing in terms of this march that took place in June of that year. And it was a massive march. One of the other things that helped bring people out to that march, had a little right-wing fascist group called Breakthrough, headed up by a guy named Donald Lobsinger. And he would be harassing various demonstrations we'd have around the city. Anyway, he came out after the announcement of the march with King that was organized pretty much by Reverend Franklin, Reverend Clegg, and a few other folks like that. And he said he was going to stop the march. So a whole lot of us got in the march for the fight. We didn't get in there to see King. But if he was going to stop it, we wanted to see this. And, you know, a whole lot of people of that ilk from the projects and all got in the march not to see King. But we got in there for this fight we was going to have when we got downtown looking for Donald Lobsinger. And I keep explaining that to people because that march was massive. It was on Sunday after church. And all the ministers brought their congregations out. That's the only demonstration I ever remember my father going to, you know, but all the church people came and joined the march after church. And that's when King made his first preliminary I Had a Dream speech. He made the speech in a real formal way August of that year in Washington, D.C., but Detroit is known for that big, huge march in 1963. Everybody was in that march that you can count on. And almost everybody you talk to from that era will tell you they were there, pretty much. I remember a story written in the Free Press newspaper after that march. I always like to talk about this. They had a little column in the Free Press called Pipeline Pete, and have little comments people would make. And I never forget the one, I think it was in Tuesday after that march. It said, this guy had wrote this article, he says, I went out to Belle Isle last Sunday, and there was no watermelon rinds on the ground, and no chicken bones laying all over the place, and no beer cans laying all over the Belle Isle. And I really enjoyed my park. I think we should have one of these marches every weekend. So this was a reactionary white guy commenting on the fact that one of black folks at Belle Isle that day. But I'm just trying to show you how the city was polarized. It best captures that, I think, from his opinion of what happened. But anyway, after Chuck and I both went to work at the Ford plant, and we had an opportunity to go to Cuba. I know Chuck might have told you the story before.
We haven't talked yet. I haven't talked yet.
Oh, okay. We had an opportunity. We were invited. I wish I had brought that passport. You need to see the old U.S. passport, because what happened was the Cuban Revolution took place in 1959. It wasn't clear which direction Fidel and them were going until about 60, 61. At first, people viewed it might be just another democratic revolution, and it may not go to the left. After it became clear that Cuba was going into the socialist sphere, then Cuba was added to the U.S. passport as a country you could not go to. Now, you got to look at these passports sometimes because they're real instructive. I still got my old one at the house. They had 4 countries you could not travel to. You could not go to the communist portions of North Korea, North Vietnam, China, and Albania. And then typed in was Cuba, that had been added to this list, right? So it's kind of difficult to understand what is the logic for this. Why are these the countries you can't go to? If you're anti-communist, why is the Soviet Union not on here? Why is East Germany not on here? Why is Czechoslovakia not on here? The only thing that you're left with is that it's these non-white communist countries you're not supposed to go to. You know, you're left with this kind of logic, right? Because what else could you think? Anyway, I just want to mention that because what happened was that after Cuba was added to that list, then the Cuban Federation of Students financed a couple of trips from here. One trip left the year before in 1963. They wanted students to come to Cuba in defiance of the travel ban to challenge the law. And the first trip went in '63. And when the next trip came, I think they had specific instructions to find some black students that they could bring on this trip. And therefore, our little group called Uhuru down in Wayne State was contacted. And 4 of us went, Chuck and myself and a guy named Luke Tripp and Charles Johnson. All 4 of us were members of Uhuru, and we went on that trip. I mentioned that. I'll probably let Chuck talk a lot about that trip later, as dramatic as it was. But the reason I mentioned it because we couldn't tell anybody where we were going. We had to sneak out of here, right? So we were both working at the Ford plant. We couldn't be up front about where we were going. We went to take a leave of absence. They wouldn't give us for 1 week. So when we came back from Cuba 2.5 months later, clearly we didn't have no job. So that's what happened to our little Ford experience. Cuba was a dramatic experience for us all. I got a real education. Cuba was a revolutionary laboratory, not just from the standpoint of talking and seeing the Cuban people, but revolutionaries from all over the globe was in Cuba. You know, people that was fighting for freedom in South Africa. This is 1964 now. People were fighting for liberation in South Africa, Rhodesia, all over the African continent, all over Asia, Vietnamese fighters, people from Latin America, all the Latin American countries. A lot of them were engaged in struggle, had been wounded in battle, and they'd come to Cuba to convalesce, and we got a chance to meet all these people. The other thing we did, we went systematically to each one of these countries that was listed on this passport where you couldn't go. We figured we better go here because there must be something good about these places if these are places we can't go to. That's just a little backward kind of logic, but it made sense. And I think the most interesting one was Albania, because we go in these Albanian embassy and we don't know nothing about Albania. We asked them about it, and these people look like they white, right? They're Anglo-American, and we go to talking to them, and they tell us they've been fighting imperialism ever since Julius Caesar. And we almost fell out of the chair. Hey, look at this. You know, so we met the Albanian people and we talked about them. But anyway, I'm just trying to tell you what an experience it was. So one of the critical persons that we met in Cuba was Robert Williams. Let me say this, we did get a chance to play baseball with Fidel Castro. We met with Che Guevara. We spent a lot of time with Robert Williams, who had been in exile from here because he built a rifle club in Monroe, North Carolina, inside the NAACP chapter. It's a story called Negroes with Guns. You probably want to revisit that at some point. That's a story that they have not talked much about. But it was, you know, they got the dialectic working like this. It was Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X, but that wasn't the dialectic. It was Martin Luther King versus Robert Williams. He was a dialectic. Malcolm X was sending money for guns to Robert Williams. They were the ones that were shooting it. Robert Williams was the one that had rejected nonviolence. And they had debates. King and Robert Williams had debates. It's printed in, I don't know if you got access to those debates they had. Robert Williams and Martin Luther King on the question of violence.
I don't remember.
Back in '63. I think we had it at the time of his that memorial we had for him. Anyway, I just want to take you through that quickly to just try to tell you the kind of experience that was for us. And we came back in 1964, and at that time, Charles and I went out to Ford to get our last check, and clearly we'd been fired, so we got in line over at Dodge Main and got a job. I'll tell you, I mean, factories was hiring back then. You could get, I told you before, you get fired in the morning, they get hired in the evening. You know, we went over there and we started working at Dodge Main. Chuck's always lucky, man. He got a job driving cars off the end of the line. I was over there sweating and bleeding, trying to keep up with these, with the jobs over in the pits. But anyway, we started working at the Dodge Main plant. I want to say something about the character of the movement here because I think it's important. I think it's very important, and many people are studying the history of Detroit for a lot of reasons. I think the last thing I heard was about 13 different people writing books on the history of Detroit because it's intermix of race and class and the complex of this city probably went further and deeper than any other movements around the country. One of the characteristic features of us was the fact that we was working every day, and therefore our movement was independent. And I want to say that because a lot of these other cities, the people that became the militants were using poverty program money. And you know, therefore with the poverty program money, when somebody decides to pull the strings, your money gone, and they're gonna really direct your movement. Here we were working every day, making our own money, and therefore we were independent. I remember one time we was almost starving to death, man, even though we was making money. But we had to rent. We couldn't buy nothing then. I can tell you, we had to rent a typewriter, man.
Yeah.
Didn't have enough money to buy. You couldn't save up enough money. We had to rent a typewriter, had to rent a mimeograph machine, and all that. And we used to keep that, and had to buy all our paper and ink because we was living in a little basement apartment. I guess like this was an underground character of our struggle, right? and we would spend all our time writing articles, typing, and running off these leaflets and flyers, trying to agitate generally about the movement here in the city. The biggest struggle, almost all of that time, was a struggle against police brutality. And if you look at all the rebellions around the countries in the 60s, all of them were sparked by this fight against the police. And the one here in Detroit was no different. You know, that was before they had stress. I'm not sure how much of history you go back to. There was no stress officers then. They had the Big Four. And the Big Four was 4 big white guys that rode in a big old Chrysler sedan. And they rode 4 deep. And they used to get out on the corner and beat you upside the head with them billy clubs. Many a fight started. The rebellion at Kercheval Street in 1966, when you look back in history, started because of that, right? A group of blacks standing on the corner outside of the bar, the Big Four riding back by and holler, "Go home." And they holler back, "You go home, we at home." You know how the story goes. And they say, we'll be here when we get back. And they say, "Hurry up." And they come back and they jump out the car, beating people upside the head, and that's when the rebellion started, spread all up and down the street. That's particularly how Kercheval started. And the Kercheval rebellion went on for about, really just the end of that day, because it rained so bad the next night. Everybody was throwing Molotov cocktails, having them quenched, you know, and everything. Because it was raining so hard, I got arrested. I was in the county jail, and we was getting wet in the jailhouse. It was raining so hard. But anyway, I want to say that because there's always been this antagonism between the black community, particularly and the police. And that's what happened in '67 when the police saw all of those with big old buses and paddy wagons they had brought out to pick up them 100 people, you know, from that so-called blind pig. That's what enraged everybody, and they started throwing bottles and bricks and things at the police car. And then the rebellion spread up and down 12th Street. Once it spread up and down 12th Street, then it was going to spread all over the city. The first thing, you know, the looting and stuff, the first thing that hit was the pawn shops. I'm telling you now, because I told you how important the pawn shop was. And on the back of that pawn slip, they had in great big letters, "Not responsible for fire, theft, and other unavoidable events." So if you had something in that pawn shop, you had to go get it. I still lost, I think, a record player or something in that pawn shop. Wasn't able to get out of there, but everybody crashed in pawn shops first, and then the rebellion just started. You know, the police would come and force with the tactical mobile unit with the bayonets, and they'd run everybody off the street. As soon as they split, everybody would careen up behind them and start throwing bricks, and they couldn't contain it. You know, that rebellion lasted about 7 days. You got to remember, prior to the Rodney King rebellion in LA in '92, that the Detroit rebellion was the biggest rebellion in the country, in the history of this country. You know, and I forgot how much property was destroyed and how many people all was arrested. But I know they arrested 5,000 people and had them locked up on Belle Isle. You know, so when they tell you today about a Patriot Act, they don't need that when they get ready to get you. You know, they had 5,000 people on Belle Isle. I was lucky. I got arrested the first night. I got sent Ionia State Penitentiary up in Ionia, Michigan, but the people that got arrested later were locked up on Belle Isle, and they had to live on that island under those horrible conditions. And all they tell you is that if you want to leave, go on swim. You know you couldn't make it to Canada. I mean, that's the kind of treatment you got down there. But anyway, that's kind of a background kind of material to my involvement and my learning. I started in the movement off of practical struggle. I guess my first enlightenment came when I was going to Highland Park Community College. It was a girl at the college whose sister wrote for Muhammad Speaks newspaper. And she used to bring Muhammad Speaks newspaper to school. And I first got acquainted with that newspaper. Then I started asking questions. I didn't know that the Muslim movement began here in Detroit. I didn't know that Muhammad's Mosque, #1, was right on Linwood Street. And that angered me, because I done grew up in the city all this time and didn't know that. And I started getting attracted to the mosque. I'd go over to the mosque, and Muhammad Speaks newspaper was important because it was doing all kind of international news and reports from all over the country. And it became a real learning process for me to study and learn that. The news was just breaking about Malcolm X and his rise and him coming, coming to the forefront. And my first acquaintance there was in 1962. The Muslims still today have what they call Savior's Day in February of each year. And that year, Savior's Day celebration was scheduled to be here at the Olympia Stadium. The Olympia Stadium is over there on McGraw. It used to be over there on McGraw and Grand River where that National Guard Armory is now. But it used to be, that was the biggest stadium in Detroit. That's where all the basketball games was played. That's where the Globetrotters would come. That's where
Hockey.
boxing, hockey match, everything was at the Olympia. It was the biggest. It's gone now, so it doesn't make sense. But they had a bazaar the day before down at Chuck's old church, King Solomon Baptist Church down on 14th and Marquette. And I went over to that bazaar that night. Bazaar, they call it bazaars then. Now it's considered like flea market, or what do you call that stuff when you, vendors. You know, where you get vendors, they call them vendors now. Back then they call it a bazaar. Everybody would bring a little something, set up a stall. I went over there and bought a couple of books from a guy that was selling books, and that kind of began my catechism, because I took those books home and read them. And I was lucky enough that the guy passed away last year named Austin Chabot. He had his address stamped in that book. And when I finished that book, I went and found his house. They didn't have no phone. And I found his house, and he sold me another book. And I'd take that one home and read it, and he'd sell me another one. And that became my catechism, and directed me like that. And I ended up joining in the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement. At that time, it was later headed up by Carlos Cooks out of New York. And his philosophy was like all the rest of the nationalist movement: go east, black man. Ain't no hope for you here in America. Go to Africa. And that's the kind of outlook I had. I had a chance to read in Muhammad Speaks about Patrice Lumumba before he was killed in the Congo, and how he had came here and appealed for black Americans to come to the Congo and help him develop that country. So you kind of had that kind of outlook at the same time, and I kind of adhered to that. And when me and Chuck went to work at Ford, I figured that what I needed to do was go in there and learn me a trade, because I didn't want to take my naked behind back to Africa like I left. Let me at least learn something, so I can go back here with some kind of contribution. And we couldn't get in the apprenticeship program. Took the test out there to get in the apprenticeship program. I was going to apprentice in the fire trades, going in for Ramadi, because the Congo was real rich in ore deposits and everything, and I figured foundry work would be really critical. Couldn't get in the trade. We both passed the written test, but in order to get on the list, your mom and daddy had to work at Ford, you had to have military service, and you had to have trade school. Now, no young blacks in Detroit went to trade school in those days. All white boys went to trade school. We had a couple of years of college, but that didn't count. So even though you passed the written test, you couldn't get on the list. So I got stuck. I had to start changing plans then. I ain't got nowhere to go, because I ain't got nothing I can learn I can take with me. Anyway, that's just as an opener. Chuck, I don't know how long we want to go. I just wanted to try to use opening a little bit to try to see how much you want to cover and how much in depth you want to go. What's your pleasure?
It's
Did I
up to
miss
you.
it?
I have to go, but, no.
Anyone you.
What about talking about your current efforts and how you mix theory with practice?
Okay.
Also, would you say something about the significance of the debates that we had within the league, in terms of political role?
Yeah. Let me say this. You got to understand, I think part of what you got to understand is the period of the 1960s. it was a vigorous changing time. You got to understand the 60s followed the 50s. That was the McCarthy period and the whole Red Scare and all the witch hunts that was held by the government, threatening anybody that had any kind of left-leaning or thought about any kind of revolutionary activity. So when you get to the 60s and the civil rights movement is developing, you get to a period where things are breaking and revolutionary theories are being promoted. Not so much from here, but the whole third world is in an uproar, right? Independence of Ghana, independence of Tanganyika, the Cuban Revolution. Frantz Fanon is writing stories, Wretched of the Earth and those books that he put out became real Bibles for us. So it was a period of time where revolutionary theory was really being fomented. We began to study ourselves and try to learn revolutionary theory. Automatically you turn, and not like that, probably not like that today, but automatically you turn to Marxist theory. Studying the theories of Marx and Engels, Lenin and Stalin, and all of these leaders that had led revolutions, became part of what we studied. We studied these things with the left. I remember particularly we had a class on the large and small of Hegel, taught by Martin Glaberman at a little office they had up there. And it's nothing harder to read even today, as far as I'm concerned, than Hegel, trying to understand Hegel. So, but I'm just trying to tell you the attempts we made to try to understand philosophy and revolutionary theory. Based on that, we began real debates within the movement, about which direction to go in. Part of the reason that led us to organizing workers was the fact that the little black movement that was developing in the city had become a little weekend movement, as far as we're concerned. And we always refer to those movements as bees, boobas, and bullshit. People didn't want to do nothing but put on dashikis and talk shit, and have a cultural upheaval instead of changing the system, which kind of inspired us to start trying to figure out a way to tackle the system, head on. I remember we used to have, at LaSalle Park over on Linwood, we'd have Black People's Parliament. And people would go over there and get elected to high head potentate and all this nonsense. That's a reference back to the days of fraternities. So we began to get a different pole begin to develop. It began a pole in the movement between what's called the cultural nationalists and the revolutionary nationalists. The cultural nationalists, represented at that time by Maulana Karenga, who invented Kwanzaa, right? And at that time, Baraka was pretty much on that wing. And then the revolutionary nationalists, people that wanted to fight and change the system. So a real poll and debate developed in that. In the course of this, the Panther Party rose, and they were part of the revolutionary section that wanted to change society. But they had a different outlook than us because they kind of had outlooked at what we call a lumpet, or the brothers on the streets going to lead the revolution. Our opinion was that workers were going to lead it. And I want to say that because we learned a real lesson during the Detroit Rebellion. That when the National Guard was called in here and they held down the west side, and the 101st Airborne was brought in and held down the east side. And when they instituted martial law, if you got sick, you couldn't go to the doctor. If you got hungry, you couldn't get no food. But if you had a badge from Chrysler, Ford, or General Motors, you could get your butt through every one of the police lines to go to work. And we made a fundamental decision at that point that the only place that black people have any importance in this society is at the point of production. And that's why we turn our efforts towards organizing at the point of production, because we figured we had enough power that could hurt them. Nothing else could hurt them. I guess they wouldn't care if the whole black community went up in smoke at home. They didn't give a damn because it didn't hurt them, right? But when you went to attacking them institutions that brought in the money, and the capitalist system that created the commodities that made this thing work, then you really begin to hurt them. So that was the basis for some of the debates that started. It had a debate between the cultural nationalists and the revolutionary nationalists. We had a debate between those that thought that people on the street was going to lead the revolution and those that thought the workers in the factory was. And the mix was the level of community organizing that had to take place for both to work. So those are some of the series of debates. On the question of theory, we struggled and fought to get theory. We didn't have a lot of people that could master Marxism as a science to bring that to you. We attempted a whole lot of things. We brought a whole lot of people in here to help teach us that end up kind of really being failures in a lot of ways, because we weren't able. We had 35 workers coming to classes on the weekends to study Marxism, and didn't have anybody that could effectively teach it in a way that it really meant something. You know, so in a rudimentary way, that's the struggle for theory you had. Today I consider myself a Marxist. I have been able to grow, and I would not say that earlier, because Marxism as a science it's not to be learned by rote. We have to try to figure out how to learn its tenets and try to carry out its tenets within these times. And that's what I spend most of my time doing. I belong to the League of Revolutionaries for a New America. And in that, we try to organize other revolutionaries to prepare for revolutionary upheaval in this country. Our outlook on the current set of circumstances is that we live in revolutionary times, because the revolution first starts in the economy. And we've seen the introduction of the computer chip and the robot into the productive process is disruptive.